Ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends, what a pleasure it is to be with you this evening. I am honored by the invitation from the Fish Interfaith Center and the Latter-day Saints Student Association under the auspices of the John A. Widtsoe Foundation to speak with you tonight. I commend you on your efforts and commitment to foster understanding of how the Church and its members engage in our modern world, and how they can make a difference as they associate with other faiths, education, and civic leaders to make this world a better place to live. And thank you for the beautiful music choir. It was really uplifting. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be among so many who share our values of community service and interfaith harmony. The topic I have been asked to speak on is one that is very near and dear to my heart. When I was called to be the presiding bishop of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints a little over 2 years ago, Thomas S. Monson, who was the president of the church at that time, summarized my responsibilities in just a few short but somewhat daunting phrases. One of those was that I was to care for the poor and the needy of the world. Just thinking of the magnitude of that charge could have been enough to leave me feeling the weight of the world upon me. But what kept me from buckling under that weight was the knowledge that a vast and inspired system for caring for the poor and needy had already been designed and refined by those who came before me, a system so unique and remarkable that it has gained worldwide recognition for its ability to take care not only of the church's own, but also to reach out to millions of others across the world. In fact, the welfare program of the church frequently makes headlines. An NBC News report from 2012, for instance, reads, I quote, "In an industrial park in Salt Lake City, the Mormon Church maintains a vast 500,000 square foot warehouse with enough goods to rival your local Costco." Close quote. And a 2016 Religious and Ethics News Weekly report adds the following: "Everything goes through here to 114 storehouses across the country with enough provisions to meet the projected demands in the US and Canada for 2 years." Close quote. Statistics such as these are eagerly consumed in a society that is fascinated with size and complexity. But I would argue that to understand the heart of the LDS Church's welfare and humanitarian efforts, we need to look well beyond the facts and the figures. Allow me to illustrate my point with a few images. The photo you see here is a common depiction of our disaster relief efforts around the world, with our volunteers sporting their iconic Mormon Helping Hands t-shirts. Reports coming to my office will commonly cite the number of volunteers who showed up following the disaster, the volume of hours they donated, and even the quantity of tools and supplies we shipped to enable them to do their work. But allow me to show you another photo that reveals more about what takes place at the personal level, both for these volunteers and for those whom they serve. On the surface, this photo here, taken in September after the flood in Houston, looks similar, but let me tell you a little bit more about each of the individuals shown here. In the foreground, you see an 11-year-old young man who has already brought out dozens of loads of debris from this home that you can see on the picture, and is taking a well-deserved but brief rest. His parents, not pictured here, are still working inside the home with their other son. On the left, you see a gentleman who is not in a yellow t-shirt. He's a member of another religious congregation working alongside our own volunteers. At the center of the photo is the young man's grandmother, Kathy, listening to the exhausted homeowner, whom I'll call Linda, recount her attempts to deal with the destruction of their home, while her husband is in the midst of battling a colon cancer. Just a few seconds later, the photo would have shown the two women embracing as Linda tearfully tells Kathy that she doesn't know how she would have managed without the volunteers' help. And as Kathy comforts Linda shortly before she drives to the hospital to be present for her husband's next procedure. And finally, also not pictured, are Kathy's own parents, who at nearly 80 years of age are helping to run the Volunteer Command Center in Houston. To me, this photo reveals the true essence of the church's humanitarian outreach. Undoubtedly, the huge mess was cleaned up, and we could even measure the volume of the cleanup in pounds or cubic feet of debris cleared. But what we may not be able to measure is the increase in work ethic and human compassion of the young men who helped, or the unity developed among the 4 generations of this family as they worked side by side, or even the interfaith harmony created among the 2 separate religious groups as they labored together for a common cause. And what about the extent to which Linda's emotional burden was lightened, or the degree to which Kathy's own spirit was uplifted as she reached out to give personal comfort to Linda? Let me share another comparison. This is here the grain silo at Welfare Square, the central facility for the church's welfare system in Salt Lake City, with the silo as its most imposing feature. As such, it has become an icon of the welfare program of the church, and visitors to Welfare Square are commonly informed of the 16 million pounds of wheat it can hold, and of the amount of bread and pasta that can be produced from that wheat and distributed throughout our bishop storehouses in North America. Visitors may also be informed about how the wheat in this silo comes from farms that make up just a part of the church's 49 agricultural properties that are dedicated to the sole purpose of providing for those in need, or how it is milled at one of the 6 processing facilities in which the produce from these farms, ranches, and orchards is prepared and packaged for distribution. As visitors continue to walk around Welfare Square, they may be also introduced to one of our 43 Deseret Industry stores, where the recycling and sale of donated goods creates work training opportunities for thousands of individuals who face barriers to employment, or to one of our 94 self-reliant centers, where those seeking better education or employment are provided with principles, with tools, and counsel to help them achieve that goal. But again, while these facilities are all notable examples of the resources that empower the welfare system, they are, in my mind, not its heart. I would assert that the heart of the program is more accurately captured in this photo. This is one of the church's 30,000 bishops or congregational leaders visiting a family to carry out one of his primary responsibilities, to check on the well-being of a family within his congregation, or ward, as we call it. If he finds the family is lacking basic necessities, he may indeed activate the resources of the church to provide food, perhaps even some of that bread or pasta from one of the storehouses, or to draw from cash donations to purchase needed medications. But beyond that, he will marshal the human capacity of other world leaders who surround him. The men's organizations, known as priesthood quorums, may rally around the parents to help them obtain gainful employment or make needed repairs to the home. The women's organization, known as the Relief Society, might help with childcare, transportation, or similar services during times of illness. And in the process, both the giver and the receiver of service will be uplifted and develop bonds of brotherhood and sisterhood. Another glimpse into the heart of the church's welfare and humanitarian efforts is provided as we consider how these programs are funded. Again, a story might be the best way to explain. After listening to the accounts of the heavy destruction from the hurricanes in the US and the Caribbean last year, a couple sat down with their young children to talk about what happened and to discuss what they as a family could do. One day later, their bishop received a knock on his office door. He opened to find this family, with each of their 3 small children handing him an envelope of coins, along with an envelope containing a more substantial amount from the parents, with the request that the bishop put this money towards the church's humanitarian fund. This was in addition to another set of donations known as fast offerings, which this same family contributes every month. Now, by way of explanation, the humanitarian fund covers the church's response to disasters and its core humanitarian programs, such as providing wheelchairs, clean water projects, and vision care throughout the world. Fast offerings, on the other hand, provide the funds which bishops use to take care of the individual needs of the families in their congregations. These contributions derive their name from the church members' practices of fasting or going without meals for 1 day each month, and then donating the money that they saved from those uneaten meals. It is interesting to know that the principle of the widow's mite is alive and well. While we certainly do have large donors, a recent study revealed that over half of the increase to the humanitarian fund last year came from thousands of smaller donations of $1,500 or less. What drives individuals, most of whom are not wealthy, to make these personal sacrifices? What is it? Well, I may say the first answer, of course, and one that is not unique to the Mormons, is devotion to Jesus Christ and his gospel, and particularly to what Christ referred to in Matthew 22 as the second great commandment, that is, that thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. The question might be asked, why should a church deal with so-called temporal matters such as food production or employment counseling or clothing donation or even wheelchairs? Shouldn't it be focused on spiritual matters such as prayers and scriptural passages and sermons? Such questioning elicits a core principle that the temporal and spiritual aspects of our lives are fundamentally intertwined. A prominent church leader once stated, I quote, "You can't have peace of mind and be in want materially. You can't have the spirit of the gospel in your hearts with an empty stomach. And so, in the plan of the Master, there is provision not only for the salvation of the spirit of man, but also for his physical being." This same principle was amply illustrated in the life of the Savior himself. While much of his time was dedicated to teaching, as evidenced by his powerful sermons and parables, the biblical accounts are just as replete with examples of his feeding the multitudes and healing the infirm. One notable example occurs during Christ's healing of the man afflicted with palsy, as recounted in the 2nd chapter of Mark. Christ surprises the onlookers by first telling the man he is forgiven of his sins before physically healing him. When questioned about this unexpected approach, the Savior pointed out the relationship between the spiritual and the physical healing. He asked, "Is it easier to say, 'Thy sins be forgiven thee,' or to say, 'Arise, and take up thy bed and walk'?" It is our conviction that no person can truly claim to love God without also reaching out and lifting up God's children, both through offering spiritual comfort and providing for temporal wants. Those two aspects of service are more closely connected than we may often realize. Of those I have personally known in my life, there is no one who understood or exemplified these dual but related aspects of service more fully than our recently departed president, Thomas S. Monson. While it was a singular privilege to be set apart as a presiding bishop under his hands, it was in some ways also overwhelming, because I knew very well the type of bishop he was himself. President Monson was called at the remarkably young age of 22 to be the bishop of a congregation of 1,080 members, many of whom were struggling financially, and 85 of whom were widows. At Christmas time, he would take days off work so that he could pay a personal visit to each of those widows and even deliver Christmas chickens to them. When he was called to be an apostle of the church 14 years later, one would think that his demanding schedule of administering church business, traveling and teaching, would disrupt his ability to reach out on such an individual level. But President Monson operated on a higher plane than most of us. Until the very last years of his life, he would be found in his free time visiting hospitals, care facilities, and homes of the elderly to lift and to cheer. He understood that regardless of how many sermons he preached over the pulpit, what mattered even more would be the sermon that he taught and exemplified throughout his life. It is from President Monson's example that I learned that the welfare program of the church is simply a support system designed to facilitate what really matters, which is the service for and by individual people, with the end of lifting them both temporally and spiritually. Under President Monson's leadership, caring for the poor and the needy, although a core practice of church members since the church's inception, was formally recognized as one of the 4 divinely appointed missions of the church. This emphasis will undoubtedly continue under our new president, Russell M. Nelson, who shares President Monson's commitment to those in need and who has declared that, I quote, "Few, if any, of the Lord's instructions are stated more often or given greater emphasis than the commandment to care for the poor and the needy," close quote. The second answer as to why church members may be so quick to donate of their time and means is that they have come to understand not only the impacts that their contributions or service will have on those in need, but also the impact that it will have on themselves and on their family members who serve with them. Remember the example of the young children who handed their coins to the bishop. Those coins may translate to a portion of food or a drink of clean water for another child, the receiver, who will experience first physical relief and second spiritual comfort to know that there are those who care. And as for the young givers, their hearts will be touched at an early age with a pattern of gratitude for what they themselves have and pattern of active compassion for those who may lack. It is this phenomenon, the mutually beneficial impact that service has on both giver and receiver, that drives us as a church to not only provide aid through donated money and supplies, but to build in opportunities for service and personal interaction. We have even developed a website called justserve.org that can be used in any community to publicize needs and allow church and community members to select and sign up for service opportunities. In reality, we are known at least as much, if not more, for our humanitarian volunteers as we are for our humanitarian programs and funds. This is intentional, and it is reflective of our theology. For Mormons, the church is not merely defined as the building in which we meet, or even the organization itself. Rather, the definition of the church might be derived from a passage in the Book of Mormon, which states the following: "And they," meaning the group of believers and disciples, "did do all things, even as Jesus had commanded them. And they who were baptized in the name of Jesus were called the Church of Christ." Close quote. In other words, the church is all about the individual members who are bound together by common beliefs, covenants, and values. These commonalities are developed as we interact and serve with one another. This concept of the church being the sum of its individual members can in many ways be expanded to apply to our overall welfare and humanitarian programs. At the core, they are no more or less than a collection of individual donors and volunteers who contribute their time and means for a worthwhile cause. In this case, our church family, if you will, is expanded to include partners and community members like many of you today, who, though not of our faith, are nonetheless united with us by the shared value of caring for those in need. It is as we interact with each other, serving side by side, that we are mutually uplifted by one another, and it is for this reason that we strive to include volunteer service in our humanitarian efforts whenever possible. Another reason for encouraging volunteerism is because it fosters a love for work. As I have mingled with our members who engage in disaster cleanup projects, I have always been very impressed with the smiles on their faces as they are carrying out some very taxing and sometimes unpleasant tasks. In part, these smiles come from the satisfaction of tackling and accomplishing the harder job. It is likewise remarkable to observe how those who have suffered losses in these disasters, as they team up with our volunteers and work alongside them, can feel their own worry and grief begin to give way. The participation of those who have been affected is also important from the standpoint that it reinforces the principle of self-reliance. Rather than being passive receivers of the service, they contribute their own labor to the effort. Self-reliance has been a foundational principle of the church's welfare program ever since its inception, which occurred during the years of the Great Depression in 1930. Unemployment in some sections of Salt Lake City reached nearly 70% at that time. While local congregational leaders were certainly concerned with their members' lack of necessities, what alarmed them just as much as that was the rampant idleness that was leading to discouragement, hopelessness, and even family tensions. In this setting, a group of leaders were inspired to reach out to local farmers who could not afford to hire enough labor to harvest all of their crops and had to leave much of their produce to spoil. These leaders arranged with farmers to put the men in their congregations to work on their farms, where they would be paid not with dollars, but with a portion of the food that they helped to harvest. This proved to be so successful that there was not only enough for these laborers and their families, but also a surplus to provide for others in need. and the canneries and storehouses that were set up to process and distribute the surplus were the beginnings of today's welfare system. But just as importantly, this plan provided hundreds who would have otherwise been unemployed with the blessing of work, which in turn fostered a return of their self-esteem. Notably, when the First Presidency of the Church formally organized and announced the welfare program a few years later, the statements they issued focused not on the material aspects of the system, but rather on the core principles underlying the program and the effect this would have on the people. I quote, "Our primary purpose was to set up a system under which the curse of idleness would be done away with, the evils of a dole abolished, and independence, industry, thrift, and self-respect be once more established among our people. The aim of the Church is to help the people to help themselves. Work is to be re-enthroned as the ruling principle of the lives of our members," close quote. 80 years later, this statement still guides all of our welfare and humanitarian efforts. Recipients of goods at the bishop's storehouses don't just take a handout. They are asked to provide work or service for what they receive and are helped to get back on their own feet as soon as possible. Rural communities in developing countries don't just receive a water system, they contribute all the labor they can and form a committee who is trained to oversee its long-term maintenance. Why? Because the focus is not on the provision of the resources, but rather on the building and lifting of the people. In speaking of the value of self-reliance, I would be incomplete in my comments if I failed to mention the practice of preparedness. Many are aware of church members' long-time practice of maintaining supply of food, water, and other essentials in their homes, as well as a financial reserve in their accounts. Some believe that we do this in anticipation of some apocalyptic event. Undoubtedly, such a supply does come in very useful in the wake of a natural disaster. But much more frequently, we see members drawing upon their reserves to help them weather more commonplace events, such as a prolonged job loss or illness. Furthermore, the principles of preparedness and self-reliance are not only intended to benefit oneself and one's family, but also one's neighbors and community. From an early age, church members are taught how to work in councils, to prepare for and solve any range of challenges they may face. As is the case with an example I would like to share with you from Hurricane Harvey, the result is sometimes remarkable. The man in this photo you see here is Phil Garner. He's an elders quorum president, meaning the leader of a group of several dozen men in his ward in Houston. When the flooding occurred, his own family was taken care of because they had an adequate stock of supplies. So he felt a desire to help out in his community. He phoned a friend who was a deputy and said, "I have a boat. Is there any way I can help?" It turns out that the sheriff's department was completely overloaded with calls, so his friend gladly accepted the offer and gave him the address of a family in need of rescue. As Phil took his boat to the flooded neighborhood and picked up the family, he noticed that no other rescue vehicles were out and realized that action was needed on a much larger scale. He returned home and posted on his ward's social media group that there was a need for rescue boats, hoping that he might get another couple of boats or maybe a handful of volunteers. But the next day, dozens of his ward members showed up at the designated meeting spot at their church Many brought boats, others brought food and supplies for those who would be rescued. Learning of the organization, the sheriff's office began channeling requests their way. And soon the scale became so large that the church was turned into a boat dispatch center and eventually into a shelter center for families who arrived with nowhere else to go, as Red Cross shelters reached their full capacity. As word of the effort got out, boat owners in the community began to join in, and within a matter of days, 800 volunteers with 57 boats had come together to rescue over 850 residents. What began as one phone call from Phil turned into what some community officials called the most organized rescue effort operating anywhere in the city. To outside observers, the management of this rescue effort seemed extraordinary. For Phil and his fellow ward members, it was simply putting into practice the principles of preparedness, organization, and leadership, which they had learned through a lifetime of church participation. What occurred in Houston is evidence of the principle that the church's welfare system, at its core, is not a massive program managed from Utah. More often, it is the inspiration and initiative of a small group or single individual acting on basic values of self-reliance and caring for one's neighbor. May I conclude my remarks by sharing with you my own experience in Houston following Hurricane Harvey. Elder Dieter F. Uchtdorf, then of the church's first presidency, and I flew in just days after the flooding, both to observe the relief efforts and to be with and comfort the impacted members. As we neared the airport, I looked down to see a huge parking lot filled with hundreds of overturned vehicles. Arriving at the church building that had been designated as the central meeting place for the volunteers, we were expecting to see a similar devastation. What we saw instead both surprised and humbled us. As we entered the church building, the same one from which the boat rescue effort had been operated just days prior, we found over 700 members in yellow t-shirts, all with smiles on their faces and ready to work, inside a facility that had been cleaned until it was sparkling. There was no doubt that many of these individuals had had their own homes affected. But for that day, they had decided to turn outward, and by doing so, boosted their own hope and morale. As I looked out over that vast congregation of yellow shirts, there was no question in my mind that the welfare program of the church does indeed relieve suffering on a large scale. But what was clearly the most impressive to me is the change that it effects within each individual. By reaching out to lift others, these volunteers were lifted themselves. I witnessed in that scene, and in so many others like this, around the world, the fulfillment of another of the early statements made by the First Presidency, with which I would like to close. I quote, "The real long-term objective of the welfare plan is the building of character in both givers and receivers, rescuing all that is finest down deep inside of them, and bringing to flower and fruitage the latent richness of the Spirit, which, after all, is the mission and purpose and reason for being of this church." Close quote. I wholeheartedly echo that sentiment. Thank you. May God bless you all. Thank you very much.